Okay, so maybe I can append that after we're done. Okay, so the recording of this webinar, as well as the slides and other materials, are going to be emailed to all of you, and it's also going to be posted on the Coalition's website and probably our website also. And because there's so many of you participating, it's possible that we may not have enough time to respond to all your questions. So our plan is, for any questions that we don't get to in the time allotted, we're going to come up with written responses to those and make those available to everybody as well. Okay, so let's get started. What changes will we see to INFONET after July 1st? The first change is gender identity. What you now know of as the gender field is going to be labeled gender identity. It's still going to be a mandatory field as gender is. However, the additional options that we're going to include, which you'll see shortly, gender, queer, and transgender options, it will be optional to use those. Also, the field is still, okay, I'm hearing that the sound is still bad. Ask them to mute. But there's no call-in option, so they shouldn't. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry that some of you are having a hard time hearing. I have the microphone as close to me as I possibly can, so I'm going to continue to do that, and hopefully we can improve as we go along. So getting back to the gender identity field, this is still going to be a drop-down field where you enter one category into INFONET, and these modifications for the gender identity field will apply to all types of clients. For DV programs, it's going to appear in both adult and child clients. And for the sexual assault programs, you're going to see this change for both victim and significant other clients. And as with other fields in INFONET we collect during the intake process, remember that the client always chooses which category they most identify with, and Lisa's going to talk a little bit more about that as well. The current options you now see in the gender field are female, male, other, and the sexual assault programs have an unknown category. So let's see what new options you're going to have in this field. The first new option is trans female, where somebody whose sex is or was male, but they identify as female. That's going to be a transgender female. A transgender male is just the opposite, somebody whose sex is or was female, but identifies as male. The third new option you're going to see on this drop-down menu is gender queer, gender non-conforming. And this is someone who doesn't necessarily identify as male or female. They may be somewhere in between, or they don't identify with either gender. The other field is still going to be available, but I'm hoping that your intake forms, and I'm going to be revising the client intake forms, and those will also be made available to you after the new fiscal year begins. So you allow the client to write in another term if they identify with something else, and just keep track of that. But only the other option will be entered into INFONET. Unknown is an option for only the sexual assault programs, and the final new option in this gender identity field is going to be not reported, and that means that the client did not want to provide this information. Okay, the next new change, the second change you will see in INFONET after the new fiscal year begins, is a new field will be called sexual orientation, and it will be added to INFONET's client demographics tab. For DV programs, it's optional for you to use this field. For the sexual assault programs, it's actually also optional for you all, but it is mandatory that you at least complete this field, that you enter something in this new sexual orientation field. One of the options in this new field is going to be not reported. And if your center decides to not collect this information from anybody, then you're going to be using that not reported option for that field. Another drop-down, this is also going to be a drop-down field where just one category is selected. Okay, I'm seeing that Okay. I had to switch the sound choice on my computer to do speakers instead of the chosen field through the webinar. Wow. Okay, so those of you participating, gosh, I'm like providing instructions for sound when they can't hear me. So hopefully everybody can read Dorothy's chat. It sounds like she switched the sound choice on her computer so that she hears it through the speakers. And she's having a better experience. So hopefully everybody can, that method works for others. Okay, so getting back to the sexual orientation field, for domestic violence programs, okay, another thing you can do to improve the sound is to turn off other computer applications like your email or any other things you may have open. Sounds like that might help. Okay, so getting back to sexual orientation, for domestic violence programs, you will only see this field for adult client records only. And then for the sexual assault programs, you'll see it for both victim and significant other clients. And again, the client needs to choose which sexual orientation category that they most identify with. Okay, so these are the categories you're going to see in the new sexual orientation field in INFONET. Heterosexual straight, homosexual gay lesbian, bisexual, queer, and the definition we came up with for queer with Lisa's consult refers broadly to lesbians, gay, bisexual people, and others who may not identify with the labels above, but they do identify with this term. There will also be an other option, and again, only the other option will be entered into INFONET. But I'd like everybody on the intake form, if your client identifies with a term that we're not including, to write in that term. And I'm going to be seeking feedback from you all throughout the year, since this is our first year collecting this type of information. So I'd like to hear from you which terms people are identifying with. You will also see a not reported option in the sexual orientation field, and this could mean one of two things. One, it could mean that the client just did not want to provide this information, or you want to use this field if you don't collect this information for anyone, meaning anyone at all, or maybe you don't collect this information for clients who meet specific criteria. And the example I have here is maybe you're only going to collect sexual orientation or ask about sexual orientation for clients who are 17 and older. So that means for any client who's younger than that, you would enter not reported in the sexual orientation field. And then finally, the unknown field will be the last one available in sexual orientation. And I'd like you to not use this option for clients who may identify as questioning. If they identify themselves as questioning for their sexual orientation, use the other category, because the unknown categories in INFONET are meant to be for when we truly do not know what the information about our client is. So again, if they identify as questioning, enter that as an other for sexual orientation. Okay, so you might want to see what this is going to look like when the changes are rolled out. This is a screenshot of the new gender identity field. That you can see it's going to be placed in the same exact place you now see gender, and here are all the options you will see. Now this is a screenshot of the sexual assault interface, so you do see an unknown option. Domestic violence programs will not have that option. And then sexual orientation, this field will be placed at the top of the left-hand column, again on your client demographics page, and you can see you just select one of the available options I just reviewed, and then you save your client data, and that's all there is to it. They'll be very easy to use. The hard part is requesting this information, which is why I'm really grateful we have Lisa here. But before I turn it over to you, I do want to talk a little bit about protecting client confidentiality in light of this new information we're trying to gather. And this not only applies to LGBTQ clients, this applies to anybody who may have unique characteristics. So I just want you all to remember that, although we don't enter any identifying information into INFONET, like names or addresses or anything like that, it still contains a lot of information about individual people, and it's transported over the internet. So we have to be aware of whether or not we could be causing risk to somebody's identity. INFONET is very well protective. The data are actually encrypted as they transport between your computers and our servers. But again, we still need to take precautions, and this is particularly true when we're serving clients in more rural, remote areas. Providers serving urban areas don't have to be nearly as concerned as providers serving clients in the more remote areas. And remember that collecting information about clients will help us provide the most responsive services possible to all types of people that walk in the door. Not knowing information about survivors that are relevant to providing safety and quality services can potentially harm them. So we want to do the best job we can at collecting the new information, but again, client confidentiality is top priority. So if you think that's a risk, then we may not be able to collect some of the information. So how do you decide whether a client is at risk for having their confidentiality exposed? Consider where the client resides. Obviously, more rural, remote areas are higher risk. Also consider not just if they only have one unique characteristics, I wouldn't be too concerned there. It's when they have multiple unique characteristics. And just to give you a general idea, the average population percentage of LGBTQ people in Illinois is just under 4%. So, think of the least populated county in Illinois, which is Harding County, a little county in southeastern Illinois. That has about 4,300 people. So about 4% of that would be about 160 people. So, if you think somebody's at risk for being the only person, then you're going to want to use some of the techniques I'm going to mention in the next slide. But just for comparison, the Native American population in Illinois is under 1%. So that's actually a more unique population than the LGBTQ community. So if you think a client is at risk, these are some things you can do. One, when you enter their age into INFONET, change it by a few years. But try to stay in the same age group if possible, that are reflected on your INFONET search reports. For example, 20 to 29 is one age group. If somebody with unique characteristics is 28, maybe enter their age into INFONET is 25. Nobody's going to mind being a few years younger. It's not going to affect your data that much, and it's going to minimize risk of somebody being able to figure out who they are. Another thing you can do is leave out the client's zip code or city that you enter into the residence tab. And then if you share data with others, which is encouraged because you need to share your data with others in order to educate. Many of you use it for prevention programs, institutional advocacy. But if you see very low numbers for unique characteristics such as Native American or LGBTQ, and that number is very low, you would want to replace that low number with a symbol such as an asterisk. And then when you share that information, just say that that asterisk means it is a low number, less than 10. So those are some things you can do to minimize risk of client confidentiality. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa now, but I just want to leave you with a few facts you'll need to know. One, the client intake forms are being revised, and those will be available on each of the coalition's website July 1st. Also know that you will not be able to run reports displaying information for these new fields right away. We are working on those, and they will be ready before your first quarter reports are due in the fall. And again, because this is the first year we're collecting this information, please feel free to send me feedback. We may need to make changes in the years ahead because this is our first year attempt at this. So feedback is appreciated. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Do you want to answer questions concerning the form at this time?
We're going to do a question session at the end for both of our talks.
All right, good morning, everyone. It is nice to be together virtually with so many colleagues, friends, and people whose anti-violence efforts I admire. And I'm going to start by doing a really quick LGBTQ 101 refresher. And you know, it's in the 40-hour trainings that we've all been through. But of course, I recommend individual organizations need to assess your needs at your organization for additional LGBTQ training beyond what's included in the 40-hour, especially considering how long it has since some folks have taken the 40-hour, and that, you know, since the LGBTQ population is not showing up in great numbers at most organizations, you don't get a chance to practice, you know, on a daily basis those interactions. So it's good to have some additional training to feel more comfortable. After the LGBTQ 101 refresher, I'll move on to information that is very specific to this new data collection effort. So again, this is going to be really, really brief because this is information that should all have been covered previously. But if you do need that refresher, reach out and get that for your organization. What is sexual orientation? Number one point related to this is that everyone has a sexual orientation. Every person has a very individual experience, a very personal experience about their sexuality. And one of those things is related to your orientation, which is an integration of an individual person's experiences of attraction to others, behaviors that we participate in and choose to not participate in, and then identity, that whole piece about how do we view ourselves. And the identity piece is very, very important and speaks to something Jennifer brought up earlier about we don't want to just label people or identify them for ourselves. We want people to have that choice to tell us what their identity is. So what is gender when we're talking about gender and gender identity? So in here, I've included the really fun and fabulous gender unicorn slide for you. And it's important to remember, again, just like sexual orientation, everybody has an experience of gender in our larger culture. Having these experiences of gender and sexual orientation in our larger culture, oftentimes many people don't really recognize their experience of it until they are told to kind of think about it. And what that is that's a form of privilege. So if your sexual orientation or your experience of gender is very in alignment with what culture expects from you, you usually don't notice your experience of it too much until somebody points it out to you. So again, it's important to recognize that everybody has an experience of gender in our larger culture. It's also important to remember that how people express their gender is sometimes related to how someone else chooses to target them for violence or abuse. That some of us who express our gender in ways that doesn't fit with other people's expectations for us can be a way that they might choose to target us for violence or abuse. On this slide, you know, I think what's really helpful about this slide is how in these different domains of, let's take gender identity, for example, they point out that gender identity is how an individual experiences how much they align with the idea of what a woman means in our broader culture, or how much they align with the idea of what being male or a man is in our culture. And then gender expression or presentation is how much do we show people how feminine or masculine and or some of both we feel. And that is those external characteristics about clothing choices and maybe the way you sit in a chair or how loudly you talk. All sorts of different things can be related to that. And again, that's very much about culture, because our culture is what gives us the kind of rules or guidelines about what is considered feminine or masculine in our broader culture. Sex assigned at birth has to do with all those biological characteristics, physiological and markers like in terms of anatomy in our bodies, as well as chromosomes and hormones and all sorts of different stuff. And of course, we have all been learning over time that there's much more of a continuum between what would be considered 100% strictly male and 100% strictly female. In nature, there's a heck of a lot more. And actually, intersex condition falling somewhere in between strictly male or strictly female is fairly common and occurs at a rate more common than people naturally being born with red hair. And then we can see on our cute little gender unicorn's chest there, the orange and the red hearts, just kind of saying, you know, we have these things that are separate from gender, but are related to gender sometimes about other people's gender. Like, are we sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to what kind of people with what kind of characteristics? As another source of information that I think is fantastic, related to talking about gender in general and then also specifically transgender identity and genderqueer identity, is a video called Transgender Basics from 2007, and you can find it at this address on YouTube, which is always nice to have nice, free, good training materials. It's 20 minutes long, and so it makes it really, really helpful for using in like a staff meeting or another kind of potential training or continuing education time.
And I found this just by going to YouTube and
Yeah.
then in search Transgender Basics
Yeah.
2007, and it came right up.
Yeah, so Jen was saying she was able to go to YouTube and just search Transgender Basics 2007, and usually that 19 to 20 minute video is the first one listed right at the top. All right, so getting into what I will refer to as kind of the most commonly accepted and familiar terms related to sexual orientation and gender identity that is not the majority identities in our culture. So LGBTQ. In terms of, the word lesbian is typically used to describe a woman who is predominantly attracted to and interested in relationships with other women. The term gay is a very large community umbrella term, like we use it for like the Gay Pride Parade, even though the Gay Pride Parade is not just for gay men. But gay also really does refer to men who are mostly attracted to and interested in relationships with other men. Bisexual people can be of any gender, and bisexual can be a way that someone describes their orientation to being towards another person of any other gender, not just male or just female. And then transgender. Transgender is another large umbrella term, and there are a lot of different other terms that might be included under the umbrella of transgender that people use to describe their gender identity. Transgender as a term basically describes an experience for a person who usually at birth and in childhood is identified by other people as being of a particular gender, and it's often related to their biology as being identified as male or female. And so, often they'll just say a male baby is a boy, right? Female baby is a girl. But that people who identify as transgender, often their own personal experience of gender is not that what culture expects based on the sex that they were identified at as birth. So as an example of that, some of the samples that Jennifer gave about the new choices on INFONET would be to say a transgender man, is someone who was born and identified as a female, assigned the category female at birth, but they themselves actually identify as a man and often live as a man in our culture. The term queer is one that currently is more found within younger folks as part of the way that they identify. It can also be, it's definitely a word that is still used as derogatory towards LGBTQ people, but some folks use queer as the way that they describe either their sexual orientation or their gender and or a cultural identity, meaning they might say, I'm a member of the queer community. Some people will also use the term genderqueer specifically to describe their gender. Questioning, as Jennifer pointed out, questioning is it's not included in the INFONET choices at this time. And I feel like that is pretty appropriate because questioning really is more of a way to describe like a phase or a period in time that someone is going through in relation to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, as opposed to questioning being an identity, right? Questioning is more of an experience that somebody has. It is important, though, to know within our service provision environment that folks that are questioning their sexuality or questioning their gender are folks that are often at risk. They're vulnerable to experiences of abuse or violence because that LGBTQ identity, questioning difference from the norms of identifying as heterosexual or cisgender, meaning somebody who their gender fits with cultural expectations based on their biology. Being in the phase of questioning can be a vulnerable time for some folks. So what does all of this have to do with victim services? Why is it important to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity in relation to victim services? Well, we're going to talk about that. We have some data, yay, some broad data nationally that gives us some information about why it's important to talk about this. The CDC put out a report a little over 2 years ago that was made of data that they collected in 2010 on victimization. They only did it based on sexual orientation because they didn't have enough people who identified as transgender in the data pool in order to really make some broad statistical generalizations based on that. So they have it just in terms of identifying as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or heterosexual. But it's victimization particular to intimate partner and sexual violence. And when you read through this slide, I think that this data really overwhelmingly indicates that we should be seeing more lesbian, gay, and bisexual survivors for services. Having this data was so important to the most recent Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. It really helped support our arguments about LGBT people being vulnerable to violence from intimate partners in particular ways, and that, as well, we were seeing that they were underserved across the United States. It seems like people needed to see data from a neutral source like the CDC to validate what LGBTQ advocates had been saying. So this particular data, from my perspective, made LGBTQ victims visible, which is why I support collecting this data here in Illinois through INFONET in ways that responsibly protect survivor confidentiality. Because we all know, in all of our anti-violence and violence response efforts, that when folks are invisible or isolated in some kind of way, it increases the vulnerability to experiencing violence and abuse. And we definitely don't want the way that we provide victim services to be a part of supporting that invisibility. This slide is specific to talking about transgender folks and some particular violence that they experience. And again, this is like really overwhelming to think 50% of transgender people have experienced sexual violence. This information is provided by FORGE, F-O-R-G-E, which is the National Training and Technical Assistance Provider on Transgender Victimization for the Office on Violence Against Women. And they have a lot of great information on their website, including past webinars they've hosted regarding serving transgender, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming survivors. So I really recommend that you take a look at their website and see what materials they have available for you to look at, pretty much 24 hours a day. And they also frequently put out new materials as well. But this statistic about 50% of transgender people have experienced sexual violence is something Forge on fact sheet number 6, that they put that out there as being a rate that they have seen in multiple data sources. So I would take a look at their information because they have multiple sources referring to that rate, which makes it, it's not just one study, it's multiple studies that indicated that rate of 50%. So we need to make sure we talk about what might some of this vulnerability to violence and abuse be related to, and what is our responsibility around this in relation to our victim services environments. So LGBTQ people in general are still dealing with stigma in our broader culture in relation to identifying as LGBTQ. Sometimes it can seem like there's a lot of changes that are happening. There's different laws happening, and there's things about marriage, there's different things like this. But broadly, identifying as LGBTQ in our culture is not is not seen as equal yet to identifying as heterosexual or, being someone who lives in a cisgender way. And so I think that's important, and we have to figure out what can we do to prevent the impact of stigma in the way that we provide services. So these next 3 slides are reminders of which terms describe LGBTQ specific examples of bias, prejudice, and discrimination. Factors that impact both how LGBTQ survivors may experience violence and abuse, as well as experiences LGBTQ survivors may have when seeking supportive services and healing. So this first slide is related to experiences of bias. So homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in our broader culture, both displayed by individual people and in systems and organizations. Those are ways that LGBTQ people experience bias, right? And the third bullet point at the bottom there is important to keep in mind that, the process of internalization is when people that are not a part of the dominant or the privileged group hear the negative messages about their group from the majority, and how we take those messages in, and how it impacts how we think about ourselves and other people who identify us. And we have to be careful about how these internalized phobias might impact how someone is able to access services from us, and also how it might impact their view of the experiences of violence or abuse that they have had. So this slide then, talks about prejudice and heterosexism, that kind of cultural ism related to heterosexuality being superior. That shows that there is a prejudice in our broader culture. And so again, we have to figure out how might that be showing up in our service environments, and how do we decrease that in order to better serve people who don't identify as heterosexual, or people who don't identify, with cisgender characteristics. And then this final slide is about discrimination, and heterocentrism is how we see discrimination show up in broader culture. So when we see systems and institutions, and that includes our organizations, that are organized around the standard or the normal state being heterosexuality to the exclusion of non-heterosexuality. And we have to recognize that and see what we can do to decrease the impact of that in the way we provide our services, and also in the way that we each individually show up in our environments. So in order to increase survivor safety and access to healing, we need to combat how bias, prejudice, and discrimination shows up in our work and our organizations, because the heterocentrism and social stigma actually provides additional strategies other people can use to exert power and control, or to restrict how someone has access to healing, which is how barriers might come up in relation to accessing services in response to violence. So in terms of stigma, the isms, and internalization, internalization can have a huge impact on how survivors and their significant others show up in our service environments. And it can definitely impact how successfully our care and services can be received. So if we look at that definition of internalization and see how someone with a particular identity might have experiences of shame or self-hatred in reaction to their own identity, or how it is that they are other or different from the majority, that can definitely impact how does someone talk to us about the kind of violence that they experienced, right? How open will they be with us? How much will they share that will help us as providers understand their unique needs in terms of healing and safety? And in relation to talking about significant others, it's for sure people have experiences where their family members are experiencing shame related to maybe their child, or their sibling or their parent identifying as LGBTQ somehow, and that can impact how open they are and how available they are to participate in the services, fully participate in the services and support that we're able to offer. So I wanted to provide some examples that might be, familiar related to how heterocentrism and cisgenderism can show up in our services. And I'll call them, these are like examples of assumptions that are made in print, sometimes on our intake forms, and then also in our face-to-face interactions between people, and that they can impact how an LGBTQ person perceives victim services as a space or an option for them. So when we see intake forms asking clients to check off a box that only gives them a choice of male or female, or an advocate making assumptions about gender of perpetrators, right, based on the gender of the client or the survivor. And then additionally, a crisis line. On crisis lines, we can make assumptions about people based on their voices and what we think their gender is, based on what we hear of their voice over the phone. And also we'll make assumptions about the kind of relationships that they might be having. It's kind of like a fill in the blanks. If I think I am listening to a woman on the phone telling me that she has experienced abuse from a partner, or that someone sexually assaulted her, do I automatically start to fill in the blanks or ask questions like, was it your husband? Was it your boyfriend? Making these assumptions around the relationship and the genders of the people. And those are kinds of things that if we can just be open and say, the person who assaulted you, this gives people room to give us the information and tell us the story of their own experience in their own way. All right, so there have also been some recent policy changes that impact our work as victim service providers in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity and LGBTQ people. So this slide is actually from the American Bar Association and some education that they've been doing to their membership about the Violence Against Women Act 2013 reauthorization and LGBTQ inclusion. And these are the 4 main points that they brought up as being specific to LGBT inclusion. So in VAWA 13, the addition of intimate partner in terms of eligible relationships in the domestic violence definition. This is really important because sometimes things, terms like spouse or married partner or domestic partner have particular legal connotations in different states and areas. An intimate partner is much more broad and can include that, and it's non-gendered. So it's not like wife or husband, or boyfriend or girlfriend. It's non-gendered, which is nice. We actually are lucky in the state of Illinois, in relation to our laws about victimization and crime related to domestic violence and sexual violence. We have, good gender neutrality written in those that helps us out in relation to being able to really include such a broad array of relationships between the folks involved. Second point, the definition of underserved was expanded to include sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as the other categories of underserved that were already included in VAWA. Also, this 2013 reauthorization added civil rights provisions for OVW grantees, basically saying you cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, again, as well as those other protected categories already. And this includes both in your services provision as well as in your employment practices at your organization. You cannot discriminate based on someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And then the fourth bullet there is that in VAWA 13, this did create a new purpose area in the Stop VAWA grants, allowing funds to be used for projects that serve LGBT victims. And, across the country, I know people doing LGBT-specific victim support work across the country, and this has been very important for them because they were operating in jurisdictions where their authorities at the state level were saying that all VAWA money was only for programs that served women. And so this was very important to get that clarity so that they were able to participate in hopefully getting access to, victim services funding. This is another important piece and resource that I really recommend you take a listen and a look at. And because the Office on Violence Against Women and the Office on Civil Rights did a joint webinar about a year ago And you can find it here on vimeo.com at this web address. And it was a very, very helpful webinar specific to the non-discrimination frequently asked questions that they put out in relation to these changes in VAWA related to sexual orientation and gender identity. I really, really recommend watching that webinar. It was really helpful for me when I listened to it last year. Also, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, put out some guidance just this past February, and it's the guidance is titled Notice CPD-15-02, and it regards the appropriate placement for transgender persons in single-sex emergency shelters and other facilities. And something that is really nice about it is that it provided similar guidance to VAWA regarding the non-discrimination frequently asked questions regarding access for transgender people. And basically what that boils down to is people should be granted access and should be served according to their self-identified, their self-determined gender identity. And so it's nice to have these kind of consistent sets of guidance, because we know that how VAWA and HUD guidance and things like that can interplay sometimes in how we're able to provide service. Okay, so talking about gender identity, talking about sexual orientation. How do we do it? Why do we do it is first, it's always more important to say why before you start asking how. So why should we ask about sexual orientation and gender identity? And things that I think are really important to think about here is how it is that asking about sexual orientation and gender identity, having those questions about how people identify at time of intake, at time of screening, that helps some LGBTQ people think it's okay to then talk about it openly while they start receiving services. And again, it's, as a service provider, I've always thought the more information that somebody feels comfortable and safe with sharing with me, that gives me more information about how it is that I can, do my role in relation to why we're even talking to each other. So it's kind of like giving permission of saying, if we're asking you these things, we're asking you because we want to know and we want to be helpful. It is also something to know that some people might be nervous based on past experiences that disclosing might, they're worried, they might be worried that you're going to screen them out as opposed to screening them in to services. So on the next slide, we'll talk about ways that you can try to counteract that with statements that you make during screening. The second bullet point, why ask about sexual orientation and gender identity? The second point, asking everybody at that time of intake or screening sets the tone that you expect to serve all kinds of people. So you're making a statement to whoever you interact with that your organization expects you will serve all sorts of different kinds of people who need your services, and that includes LGBTQ people. And then the third point is a what not to do. And that point is to do not only ask people you think you should ask. You need to ask everybody. It's important to ask everyone, because if you choose to only ask people you think you should ask, that means you are asking based on stereotypes. You are asking based on assumptions about people, and that means you might be right about that assumption, but it also means you are missing people that don't fit those stereotypes that you're working from. And it's important to not do any of this kind of work based on stereotypes. So, how to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. It's really, really important to make sure that you are figuring out how to integrate this in both written materials for collecting the information, like a paper form, and also verbally, like for when you do interviews or over the phone type screening. And again, this is the kind of questioning that I would say we should be doing before we ask any demographic questions, right? So we don't want to just stigmatize asking about sexual orientation and gender identity by making this particular disclosure just about those categories, but information about race, information about income, all of these different things are deeply personal. And so it can be really, really helpful to say, I would like to ask you some questions about how you identify to help with our goal of increasing your safety, or to help with our goal of supporting your healing, right? That the reason we're asking this is not just because we want to collect data about you, but it also is relevant to how it is that we might be able to better serve you. And again, before you ask any demographic questions, also making sure to always do that reminder about confidentiality expectations before asking people about demographic questions. Some more how to do it. That's really important. You know, something I like to emphasize is that there are so many ways that that you are already implementing practices that are important to continue doing in terms of talking about sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So you remember to use and practice your usual best practices around doing screening or doing intakes. Or, you know, if you're handing somebody a paper form to sign out, you know, you do it in that way that feels like you really want to get this information from them, not that you're in a hurry, or not that you're irritated that they came in 10 minutes before your shift is done or something like that. You're always going to try to use these best practices, and you just have to remember to do it now also in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. So you're going to think about what is your body language conveying? What about your eye contact, the tone of voice you're using? You want to think about making people feel welcome, just as welcome as everyone else, but not overly welcome, because if it seems like you're trying really, really, really hard to seem welcoming, some LGBTQ people might get nervous about that, thinking, oh gosh, this seems like, you know, if they're trying this hard, it might seem like they're nervous that I'm here, you know. So just try to be as natural as you are with every other you know, intake. And that's the good thing, is because before you are asking the questions, you don't know anyway, unless you are working from stereotyped assumptions. So just approach everyone in the same manner. I think a really important piece to do is to practice and to role play. Anytime you are asking, you know, for new information, or your intake forms or your screening process is changing, you should be giving yourselves lots of opportunities to practice and role play, because, you know, colleagues can do a very good job of coming up with challenging questions and all that kind of stuff that helps you practice how you respond if someone asks you why you're asking for this kind of information. And the more you practice it and the more you role play it, you know, for me, it's very easy. The phrase, like, literally LGBTQ just flows off of my lips. Because I've said it like 1 million times or more in my life. For a lot of folks, you know, it might sound like LGBT, you know, it might sound more like you're not familiar with saying it. And so practicing it and getting the opportunity to have it feel more natural is going to help you feel less nervous if you have any nerves. And it will help also the people that you're talking with feel more comfortable with you if you seem less nervous. You know, and again, just to emphasize the point again, regarding people feeling welcome, because LGBTQ people are aware of stigma, and because we have experienced and have experiences of internalized homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, sometimes we may be really vigilant, like hyper vigilant, when we're accessing new environments and trying to figure out if those environments are safe environments for us, and if people are folks that are going to be able to be helpful for us, or if it might be a bad situation. So that just you know, practicing is going to be really, really helpful for helping people feel more comfortable, both yourselves and those clients and survivors and victims that are coming. So something that I think is really, really important, it might be like the most important thing to think about in relation to LGBTQ inclusion and asking about sexual orientation and gender identity for your victim service purposes, as well as, remember, your victim service purposes are those purposes. Your INFONET data is another purpose, right? You've got, what is it about this information that's going to help us serve you better? And then also, what is it about this information that's going to give us a better idea of how many people we're serving that have these identities, and or if we're not serving any and we're not finding that we're serving any, or we're not finding that people are willing to tell us that we're serving them, even if we are. These are things to really consider about outreach, about who you're reaching, and because there are LGBTQ people in every county of the state of Illinois, right? There are. And when we think back to those rates on the CDC slide, we should be seeing LGBT victims in our services. So a general framing is really important to have, because you can respond to almost any question or any challenge that somebody has about LGBTQ inclusion and sexual orientation or gender identity inclusion as questions. If you have this kind of general framing, we want to do the best possible job we can for anybody who comes in, and this information helps us to do that, right? This is framing that you can use to respond to survivor questions, questions from colleagues, questions from board members, questions from could be a reporter, the media, questions from volunteers, all of these different folks who are asking why, and it's like, no, we actually know that all kinds of people have these experiences, and we want to be ready to give them the best services we can. And then that second bullet point there is, what are the other ways? So you can have blanket statements like this that we can all just kind of learn to use as responses, but also having, practicing how it is that your organizational principles are helpful, or your organizational framing of violence and your anti-violence work. So, if you think about practicing statements that say things like, well, our mission is to support people who have survived sexual violence or sexual abuse, and we know that LGBT experiences, so we're here for them. Or you can say, well, we have values about being an inclusive or respecting diversity, like all of these different ways. We have a vision to end violence. Well, we know that LGBTQ people are experiencing violence, so that means they have to be also included in movements to end violence. These are really, really helpful general framings. And again, you can also use these framings in ways that are not just specific to serving LGBTQ people, but serving anybody. This is how you describe how we serve anybody when someone asks us, if it's relevant to what we're supposed to be doing. So I have one slide of things that I am just really advocating for not ever doing, not ever doing. And those are 4 bullet points up here. Do not ask people about their bodies or body parts. It is not relevant, right? If the guidance that we've gotten from OVW is that people should receive services according to their self-determined gender identity, whatever their bodies are like or their body parts are irrelevant, right? For the same reason, this next bullet point about we do not ask people about if they've had surgeries. People might bring this up, people might tell you these things because they are used to having to explain themselves to people, but we want to make sure that folks know that kind of stuff's not relevant. We are here to support you in your healing from the violence and abuse that you experience. We are here to support you around your safety. Are you telling me information about your body or about surgeries you've had because it's relevant to how your healing will go, or it's relevant to how you think you'll find safety? Then it's related, right? But it's not a part of screening people in or out of services. If somebody's a survivor of violence or abuse, they're a survivor of violence or abuse. Third bullet point, do not assume someone identifies as heterosexual until they tell you otherwise. So this third bullet point for me is a big piece of culture shift because a lot of us were raised within environments where, again, LGBTQ identities carry stigma with them. And so it's broadly considered more polite to assume people are heterosexual unless they tell you or you find out otherwise. Because in our culture, there's not stigma attached with identifying as heterosexual, but there is stigma attached with identifying as LGBTQ. Therefore, we kind of have this, it's heterosexual until I learn otherwise. I just encourage you to not assume anything about anyone until they tell you. And then you're not assuming because they've told you. So just don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions based on the relationships that you see. You know, earlier in that slide from the CDC, we saw bisexual women were reporting, 61% of them were reporting at some point in life they had experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking from an intimate partner. 61%. You know, I wonder how often we've been serving women and we've been assuming that they identify as heterosexual because the relationship that they're in is with a man, is a heterosexual relationship, but they might personally identify as bisexual. And if we're not talking about that, we might, you know, and if they don't feel like explicitly it's okay for them to bring that up, they might not ever disclose to us how it is that a partner's jealousy around, you know, they use their jealousy around that bisexual identity as a tool of abuse, or they've used something like that in relation to, you know, sexual violence. So these are the things that are really, really important about not making assumptions and, you know, not using practices that make people invisible. Again, on the assumptions sideline here, do not assume what pronouns people use. Don't automatically start using pronouns. Try to stay as much as you can with, you know, talking about like the person who was violent to you, the person who abused you, your, you know, partner, or is it a partner? Is it a spouse? You know, is it someone you just met, someone? Notice, you know, I'm not gendering that at all. I'm not saying, is it a man you just met, a woman you just met? Was it your husband, your wife? You can learn to use these kinds of terms until you got the information from the survivor. How to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is literally the practice that I use and have used, and the practice that I have trained people to use in the past when operating a crisis line. And so, you know, verbally saying, how do you describe your sexual orientation? So it's a way of saying, how do you describe? It's not saying, what are you, right? It's how do you describe your sexual orientation? Again, how do you describe your gender identity? It's not, what are you, but how do you describe it? And, you know, you might get a lot of responses, particularly from people who don't identify as LGBTQ, because they haven't had to answer these questions for themselves before, right? That's a part of the privilege of heterosexuality, or the privilege of, you know, living a cisgender experience, is that you don't have to really think about these kinds of questions very much, you know? And so some people, if you ask, how do you describe your gender identity? They might say to you, what do you mean? Like, you know, how do you describe what? I don't understand what you mean. So you can offer then choices, and you can just offer those choices that are on the paperwork that you're working from. Some people use words like heterosexual or gay or lesbian to describe their sexual orientation. And then some people be like, oh, okay, well, you know, I'm straight, or I'm heterosexual, or whatever. And you can do the same thing for gender. And again, you know, remember that when these information is collected via forms, the choices are already right in front of people. And of course, remembering that some folks might still need your assistance or accommodation in terms of language or literacy access. And that is a really important thing as well. If you are working with a lot of folks who don't use English as a first language, you need to make sure that, you know, you are getting some support around what might be the terms that people use, you know, to identify within that language or within that culture. All right, and then we have some additional possible responses. We've got that kind of general framing about we are always trying to meet the needs of everyone who comes to us. We want to be available to all survivors. But then you have some additional possible responses that you can do, that you can use specific to the topics of safety and confidentiality and organization mission, as well as real challenges that people might put up if they're real have negative responses about you asking. So in terms of you know, some general ways to respond specific to including the concept of safety in your response. You know, this is a safety response. Our top priority is your safety. And sometimes information about how you identify helps us work together so that you feel more safe and find the best resources, right? And again, you can use this in relation to identities beyond LGBTQ. If someone has a negative response to you, again, you can go to a safety principle. All kinds of people experience violence or abuse. We hope they see us as a source of support or assistance, right? We want to be sources of that. Even if you as an individual coming here maybe don't like that we're including these folks in our environment, we're committed to safety, and that's why we include them. Confidentiality. Some responses that specifically, explicitly speak to confidentiality. It's always up to you to decide what you want to share with me. And again, that's a general practice that we have in place. Just remember that you can use that to help support people around sexual orientation and gender identity. All the staff here will protect the information you share with us. Confidentiality is one of our highest priorities here. And in fact, it is illegal for us to disclose survivor information without your permission, right? So these are basic principles that we always work from. And so I think it's good to just, have this reminder that we can use these same principles specifically in relation to the integration of LGBTQ people and inclusion for them in our services. Organization mission. Our mission is to support people who have been assaulted, regardless of how they identify. That is like such a clear way to talk about how your mission relates to why these questions about identity are included. Our mission is to support people surviving abuse. All types of people experience abuse, and we exist to support them. That's why we are here. And we know that this information helps us do a better job of fulfilling our mission. So, usually the isn't it obvious question is kind of a defense a little bit. It can be both for folks who feel like, I'm putting off a very critical indication, that I identify as a woman or I identify as a man. And some people, this might be a spot where in some intake or screening situations where you will hear some bias or some prejudice come forward from someone in the way that they respond to you asking them these questions. And that's really, really important to know for your the functioning of your service environment, that there might be someone coming into the environment who has these, who holds these kinds of biases or prejudice. And so if someone says, why are you asking me about my sexual orientation, or why are you asking me how I describe my gender identity? Isn't it obvious, right? So the first most simple response to a question like that is we ask everybody these questions, right? We just ask everybody these questions. We let people tell us who they are, and we don't make any assumptions about them, right? And where this conversation goes after you say that, you will have opportunities to be thinking about how it is as an organization you respond to people challenging you around inclusion of people who might be different from them somehow. And I would recommend that you go back to taking a look at what practices do you have in place if someone ever challenges you around, being in an environment with people of multiple races, or being around in an environment with people with different levels of ability or different socioeconomic status or different levels of citizenship or, language access, all of these kinds, and figure out how are we going to respond, to being true to our values around how people challenge us around inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity. This can be a little more difficult nowadays because it's still more acceptable in broader culture to exclude people or to hold biases based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but you certainly can set the tone at your organization about what your expectations are for including people, and then people who participate within your organization have the opportunity to know that they can choose to participate with those expectations in place or not. That includes staff, that includes survivors, that includes volunteers. And, you can figure out how to do that. Another way to think about some of these challenges that can come from survivors, volunteers, staff, and board members is to talk about how any person can need what we offer, and we don't decrease anyone's access or prioritize another person's access over another because of bias or prejudice. That's really important to note. And again, the most helpful framing around all of this is to talk about that general framing of we want to do the best job possible for everyone and anyone who needs us, and we want our space to be open for everyone who comes here. And now I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everyone. I know we went a little bit over our 60-minute, probably 70 minutes we lasted there, but I think that's okay. The last part of what Lisa had to say was really important, I think, and we're not getting too many questions in. So feel free to ask any question you may have. Let's see what we have here. I remember somebody asked if the changes will also occur with offenders in INFONET, and the answer is no, because I don't know how many of you have maybe a perpetrator program. I don't think many of you do, but we decided not to make this change for offenders because you're not providing services to the offenders, you're providing services to the client. So if we made that change for the offenders, you would be asking the client about the offender's gender identity, which is kind of secondhand information. So we decided not to do that. But again, I want to hear your feedback during this first year that we're trying to collect this type of information. Okay, do we have any other questions? Ron Reichgeld is here with us, filtering or synthesizing some of the questions that are coming in. So what else do we have?
Well, the sexual orientation question, is that something that's required to ask on the intake form?
The sexual orientation field, no. Nobody is going to be required to ask that. We encourage it because I think, we need to try and start figuring out, how much of this population is being served. But no, it is not mandatory. However, the sexual assault programs, you at least need to complete the field. You can use the not reported option if you're deciding not to ask people that question, but you do need to at least complete the field. But yes, this is an optional piece of information to ask from clients.
Will the gender ID and sexual orientation options be added to the non-client crisis intervention data?
Okay, the question was, will these changes of gender identity and sexual orientation be added to the non-client crisis intervention page? It is not now. And that was decided because a lot of that is taking place over the phone, and I don't think the intake processes are as in-depth as they are when that's done in person. But again, if you think this is important to add in that section, either the hotline page for the domestic violence programs or the non-client crisis intervention programs. And I'm sorry I didn't include my email address in this PowerPoint, but I will certainly include that when these materials are made available. So, if you think that's important and that's going to benefit your organization, then by all means, let me know. I do remember somebody also asked when those materials would be available. I would estimate within 1 week, or before that we actually make these changes to INFONET, which may be July 1st. I need to talk with our developer about that. If it's not July 1st, it's going to be very soon thereafter, so we can start off a clean fiscal year collecting this new information.
Are the updated intake forms available prior to July 1st?
The updated intake forms probably won't be available until right around July 1st, because I have to do them. So, and we have other things to do, and that might take a little time because I think some of the formatting can be a little stubborn, and I want to make sure it's done right. So, yeah, July 1st is going to be when they're available.
When will the webinar information be available online?
When will the webinar information be available online? I would guess about a week or not much longer. And these will be emailed to you. Everybody who registered for this webinar, we will email that information to you, and it will also be made available on both ICASA's and ICADV's websites. And it will also be on our website too. I just don't know exactly where yet, but you will receive a link for where to access this information. that's it. Okay, I don't think, does anybody have any more questions? Oh, Lisa is putting her contact information up on the screen. So she provides this service if you are ever interested. Questions about the webinar should be forwarded to me. Okay, we have another question. Can you scroll up a little bit, Ronnie? Okay, the question, if a transgender person, male to female, so a transgender female who experienced DV could be accepted at the women's shelter? Well, I think that's a very good question, and the answer now is yes. They almost have to be, unless certain, Ronnie and Lisa could speak to this better than I can, but I think you have to, especially if you are a VAWA grantee or you are at risk for losing funding, and not just VAWA funding, any federal funding, if I remember correctly. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to answer some of that.
Hi, that's a great question. Yes, actually, I would really, particularly related to that question, point you to listening to the webinar that OVW and OCR did 1 year ago, because the staff from OCR that participated on that really talked about these things, and the guidance now is that people should be placed in services based on how they identify their gender identity. So if this person identifies as female, whether they use the term transgender female or woman, they should be getting access to shelter. So, my understanding of how this is moving forward is that if organizations want to have sex segregated or sex specific services, you need to be able to talk about why that is necessary to the essential operation of your program. If that is a determination that you make, you also need to be able to articulate what comparable services you are offering to people who don't meet your criteria, what you're offering to them instead. I feel like these are some of the kind of areas I would really like to support people around, because it is a shift. It's a big shift. Even, the idea of calling something a women's shelter, it's like, well, it's a shelter. And so what other ways are you offering shelter to people who do not identify as women? And then the other thing you really need to be able to work into your thinking around this is, if that person, that survivor coming, identifies as a woman, and she's coming to what you've labeled as a women's shelter, right? That means she's coming for what you say you're offering. These are all things that have to be talked about and figured about, and how is it that you're going to manage it in terms of privacy, physical space, not doing things that segregate. If you're going to offer people options to stay somewhere not within a large group shelter, how is it that you're going to give them access to all the other benefits of shelter besides the fact that there's a bed and a room and a space? Because most of us are very well aware that staying in a hotel room for a few nights is not the same as having access to domestic violence specific services through shelter for a long amount of time. And so it's going to be a real big shift, but it's something that that people really, really, really are interested in helping folks identify how to do this kind of work. Do you have anything?
No, that's it. Whatever services you provide to your clients have to be provided to each and every person that comes in for services. And the idea of separate but equal needs to be explained. If this is a case where you feel that this is somebody that, or a client that you did want to segregate, you need to explain that. And it cannot be because of the comfort level of the other shelter participants. It's something that you really have to be able to explain that was in the best interest of that particular client.
Thanks, Ronnie. Okay. One more question. Addie, yes, I'm going to email the contents of both those drop-down menus for gender identity and sexual orientation. They are in the slides, and the slides are going to be made available to everybody. We still have 8 minutes left if there are any more questions. Okay, well, if we don't see any more questions, then I think we will conclude this webinar. I want to thank you all again for participating, and again, you will be emailed the slides and links to the recording of the webinar, and there will also be new revised client intake forms available reflecting the new fields that will be included as part of the intake. So
there was a question about a certificate of attendance for the webinar.
Oh, we don't have those, but I guess I could come up with one. Dorothy, you can email me and we'll figure something out. Okay, you're welcome. I like seeing all the thank yous.
Okay, Jonathan.
Okay.
Did you turn off the recording yet?
No.
Okay.
But I will. Okay, thank you everybody. Thanks to Lisa. We couldn't have done this without her. Have a great day.